It had been months since the outbreak began. What was once a thriving society had crumbled into chaos. America, once the world's beacon of hope, had become the epicenter of the undead apocalypse. Major cities were abandoned, overrun by the flesh-hungry horde. Governments had failed, and what remained of humanity was scattered in isolated pockets, struggling to survive. In a small town on the outskirts of what was once a bustling metropolis, life had found a way to keep going. The survivors here were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, mechanics, and shopkeepers, each with their own scars from the early days of the apocalypse. But in this town, one thing had remained constant: hope. It flickered like a dying candle in a dark room, but it hadn't been extinguished completely. Samantha, a former teacher turned survivalist, had become the town's unofficial leader. She had seen her world fall apart in front of her eyes. Her students, her neighbors, and even her own family were either lost or turned into mindless monsters. But she had survived, and in a way, so had the town. They had built makeshift barricades, established curfews, and set up watch posts around their modest perimeter. It was on one of these quiet nights when the peace was shattered. A distant rumble echoed through the town, a sound not of thunder, but of something far worse. The ground trembled beneath the feet of those who dared to listen. From the tree line on the outskirts, something stirred. A new wave of the undead. But these weren't just the slow, stumbling zombies that had plagued them before. These were faster, more vicious, and they were hungry for more than just flesh. Samantha gathered the townsfolk in the main square, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to prepare," she said. "The horde's coming. We don't have much time." Her eyes scanned the faces of the people she had fought so hard to protect. They were scared, but there was something else in their eyes now: determination. These people had survived the worst, and they weren't ready to give up yet. Among the group was Alex, a young mechanic who had lost his family early in the outbreak. His hands were stained with grease, but his heart was filled with a fire that burned brighter than anything he'd known before. "I can fix the old trucks in the barn. We can use them to make a run for supplies," he suggested, his voice filled with resolve. Nearby, Emily, a former nurse who had seen the horrors of the world firsthand, stepped forward. "I can help with injuries. We need to make sure everyone's ready to fight." Samantha nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities. "We'll need more than just supplies. We need weapons, ammunition, and a plan." A gruff voice spoke from behind her. It was Frank, a retired soldier who had served in the military before the world fell apart. He had been a quiet presence in the town, but his experience in combat made him an invaluable asset now. "We can't just run. We have to hold them off. If we stand our ground, we can make it through the night." Samantha turned to face Frank, her gaze sharp. "How do you propose we do that? We don't have the manpower to take on a horde of that size." Frank's expression hardened. "We don't have to take them all on. We just need to outlast them. If we can survive the first wave, the rest of the night will be ours." The townsfolk went to work immediately, setting up traps and reinforcing barricades. But even as they worked, the distant sound of the horde grew louder. The air was thick with tension as the minutes dragged on. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the town was a fortress, barely recognizable from its former self. The streets were lined with makeshift barricades, and every window was reinforced. Samantha walked the perimeter, checking every post and making sure the defenses were solid. Alex had rigged the trucks with makeshift spikes and shields, ready to mow down any zombies that breached the walls. Emily had set up a medical station in the town hall, ready for the inevitable injuries. She had worked alongside Frank, who had trained a few of the more able-bodied townsfolk in basic combat. They were ready, but none of them knew what to expect when the horde arrived. As night fell, the air grew colder, and the distant sound of the horde's moaning grew louder. The survivors stood ready, but it was clear that they were facing a fight unlike anything they had ever experienced. Samantha could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. It wasn't just her life on the line anymore, it was everyone's. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could fight back. Hope that they could stand tall against the darkness and survive. But as the first wave of zombies crashed against the barricades, she knew the real test was just beginning. End of part 1. The town was quiet for a few long seconds, the only sound the low hum of wind moving through the trees. Then, it came, an echoing scream that cut through the silence like a knife. It was not the shrill cry of a single undead creature, but the collective shriek of the horde, growing louder with every passing moment. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she watched the distant tree line. Shadows moved within, swarming toward them like an unstoppable tide. The bloodshot eyes of the zombies glowed faintly in the moonlight, their gaping mouths drooling with hunger. This was no longer the slow, mindless mass they had learned to avoid, it was something more organized, more terrifying. We need to hold them off, now. Samantha shouted, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. She ran towards the main barricade, the townsfolk falling into place behind her. There was no time to waste. The first line of defense was the fortified gates leading into the town square. Frank had positioned several survivors with rifles and makeshift bows along the barricades, ready to pick off any zombies that attempted to breach. Alex and a few others had already taken their places in the trucks, engines humming with readiness. The modified vehicles stood like war machines, their sharp metal spikes gleaming in the moonlight. The plan was simple: if the zombies broke through the first barricade, the trucks would mow them down, buying the survivors enough time to regroup and rearm. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook. The town's first line of defense, the wooden barricades, groaned under the weight of the horde's assault. It wasn't long before the first few undead figures appeared at the perimeter, their movements jerky and erratic. Some were missing limbs, others dragged themselves forward with twisted, grotesque motions. But they kept coming, an unrelenting wave of death and destruction. Frank's voice boomed over the chaos. "Ready yourselves. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Samantha's heart raced. She took position beside Frank, her hands gripping a crossbow tightly. "We've trained for this," she muttered to herself. "We've trained for this." The first shot rang out, a high-pitched crack of gunfire. It was followed by a flurry of arrows and rifle shots, cutting down the first few zombies with deadly accuracy. But there were too many. The horde kept coming, more and more of them spilling into view, an endless tide of undead that seemed to have no end. Alex slammed his fist on the horn of one of the trucks, signaling the attack. The modified vehicles roared to life, and they barreled forward, slamming into the horde with a deafening crash. Zombies were tossed aside like ragdolls, their bodies crushed under the weight of the trucks. But for every few that fell, 2 more took their place, climbing over the pile of fallen bodies. Samantha aimed her crossbow and fired, striking a zombie in the head. Its body dropped to the ground with a sickening thud, but she didn't stop to watch. She reloaded and fired again. And again. The town was turning into a battlefield, the air thick with the acrid stench of death. Emily worked feverishly in the medical station, doing her best to tend to the injured as the chaos outside intensified. "Stay strong," she yelled to the others, trying to keep their spirits up. "We can do this. Keep fighting." As the trucks tore through the horde, the survivors held their positions, firing at the zombies that managed to get too close to the barricades. The undead were relentless, but the townsfolk weren't giving up without a fight. They had learned to survive by banding together, and this night would be no different. But the zombies kept coming, their numbers unyielding. Samantha could hear the screams of her fellow survivors as the first wave clashed with their defenses, and her heart sank. It was then that she realized just how dire their situation was. The horde was not simply a mindless force, it was coordinated, moving with a strange intelligence. It was almost as if the zombies had a leader, guiding them toward their targets. "This isn't just an attack," Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "This is an invasion." Frank glanced over at her, his face grim. "We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for the future." The survivors continued to fight, each shot and swing of the machete a testament to their will to live. As the first wave slowly began to falter, a momentary lull fell over the battlefield. The zombies that had breached the perimeter were either dead or scattered, but the threat wasn't over. Samantha wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to steady her breath. She turned to face the others, her voice hoarse but determined. "We're not done yet. The night is young, and they'll keep coming. We can't stop now." Frank nodded, his eyes burning with intensity. "This is just the beginning." And with that, the survivors braced themselves for the next wave, knowing that the battle for their town was far from over. End of Part 2. The battle raged on as the second wave of zombies closed in. The air was thick with smoke from the firebombs they had thrown to slow the horde's advance, but the scent of decay and desperation filled the streets. Samantha could feel the fatigue setting in, but there was no time to rest. They had managed to repel the first wave, but the fight was far from over. The horde was relentless, and something deep inside told her this wouldn't be the end of it. Frank stood at her side, his eyes scanning the horizon, wary of the next move. "We've got more coming," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're not slowing down." Samantha nodded, her mind racing. "But why? Why are they attacking like this? It's almost as if they're being controlled. They're moving with purpose, not just random chaos." Her thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere within the horde. It was too organized to be mere instinct. There was something, or someone, behind it all. "Keep your eyes open," Frank said, gripping his rifle tighter. "This is different. Something's pulling the strings, and we need to find out what it is before it's too late." The survivors had fortified their positions even more, moving barrels and crates to create tighter choke points, funneling the zombies into narrower paths. It was a desperate gamble, but the only one they had left. Emily had taken refuge inside the church with the wounded, administering aid as quickly as she could. There was no room for hesitation now. Alex, the mechanic, had repaired the trucks as best as he could, but even he was starting to worry. The modified vehicles had held up against the first wave, but there were too many zombies, and the vehicles couldn't keep plowing through them indefinitely. "We need more weapons," he said, tightening a bolt on the truck's makeshift ram. "I don't think the trucks will hold much longer." Samantha turned to face him, trying to quell the rising panic within her. "We'll make do with what we have. Just focus on keeping the engines running. If we can get through this night, we can regroup." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the town. The barricades that had held against the first wave had been breached, and the zombies were pouring through. Panic spread like wildfire among the survivors as they fired their weapons, but the undead didn't stop. They advanced with a singular purpose, as if they were being guided toward the weakest points of the town's defenses. Samantha raised her crossbow, aiming at the nearest zombie. She fired, the bolt hitting its skull with a sickening thunk. It dropped to the ground, but within seconds, another took its place, just as relentless as the one before. She fired again, and again, but the odds seemed stacked against them. "Keep firing. Don't stop," Frank shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of gunfire and the screeches of the undead. It was then that Samantha saw it. Standing just behind the main horde was something different. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow among shadows. But as the figure stepped forward, she saw it clearly, a person, or at least what used to be a person. It was tall and imposing, its skin an eerie shade of gray, and its eyes, those eyes, glowed a pale, unnatural blue. The figure stood at the center of the horde, like a commander directing an army. It wasn't a zombie, not exactly, but it was something far worse. A twisted, grotesque leader. It raised its arms in the air, and the zombies halted. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Samantha's heart raced. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice full of dread. Frank's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his rifle. "That's the one. That's what's leading them." The figure's eyes locked onto Samantha's, as though it had heard her words. Its gaze was calculating, almost intelligent, and a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just leading the horde, it was controlling them. And it had set its sights on the survivors. "Get to the trucks," Frank ordered. "We need to get them out of here now. We can't fight this thing directly." But Samantha couldn't look away. Something about that figure drew her in, as if it were calling to her. She could sense its power, the malevolent force behind it. This wasn't a mindless beast, it was something far more dangerous. The figure raised its hand, and the zombies around it suddenly surged forward, breaking through the barricades with terrifying force. The horde moved with renewed fury, each one driven by the command of this unseen leader. Samantha turned to Frank, her mind racing. "We need to find a way to stop it. If we don't, they'll never stop coming." Frank's face was grim. "We'll have to outsmart it. There's no other way. But we'll need time." As the horde advanced, Samantha's thoughts whirled. The enemy had just become far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The battle for survival had taken a new, darker turn, and the stakes were higher than ever before. "Alex," she shouted, her voice urgent. "We need those trucks ready. Now." The mechanic was already running toward the vehicles, determination in his eyes. But even as he worked, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that their real battle had only just begun. The uprising in dead America wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight against something far more sinister, and the odds were growing slimmer by the second. End of Part 3. The trucks roared to life as the survivors scrambled to mount their defenses, but it was clear they were fighting an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The leader of the horde, that eerie, glowing figure, still stood at the edge of the chaos, watching as his undead army tore through the town's defenses. His presence was suffocating, as if he was pulling the strings of the entire assault. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that if they didn't stop him soon, the town would be lost, along with any hope of survival. "Frank!" Samantha called out, her voice tight with urgency. "We can't just run from this. We need to figure out what it wants, why it's here." Frank's face was a mixture of determination and grim resignation. "I know. But we're outgunned, outnumbered, and out of time. Right now, survival is the priority. Once we're out of here, we can regroup and plan." Samantha didn't have the luxury of waiting. The glowing figure, whatever it was, had to be dealt with if they were going to have any chance at survival. She turned to Alex, who was hastily checking the truck's weapon systems. "How long until the trucks are ready for another run?" she asked, her voice urgent. Alex glanced up from his work, wiping the sweat from his brow. "A couple minutes, maybe. The engine's running hot, but it should hold for now. But honestly, we can't keep charging into them. There's too many." She nodded, understanding. They needed something else, a plan to disrupt the undead horde and take down the leader before it could regain control. "Get to the church," Frank shouted to the survivors, signaling for them to retreat into the fortified area. "We hold them there until we figure out what we're dealing with." The survivors hustled toward the church, weapons raised and ready. But Samantha couldn't shake the image of that glowing figure in her mind. It was as if he had known they were coming, had expected them. His eyes locked onto hers in a way that made her blood run cold. "Frank," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the figure, "it's not just a zombie. I don't think it's fully human anymore. It's something else." Frank's expression darkened as he followed her gaze. "We've been fighting these things for months, and I still don't know what they really are. But we're not getting any answers standing here. We need to push them back, then find a way to track down that thing. If we don't, it'll keep coming." Samantha agreed, but a sinking feeling formed in her stomach. "It's not just the zombies we have to worry about now, Frank. That thing's controlling them, pushing them forward." As the survivors regrouped inside the church, Samantha, Frank, and a few others stood guard, watching the horde from the window. Outside, the glowing figure had now retreated into the depths of the horde, but it was still there, like a shadow looming over everything. "We need to go after it," Samantha said suddenly, her voice firm with resolve. "We can't let it escape into the night. If we take it down, the zombies will stop coming." Frank looked at her, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. "You think if we take that thing down, the horde will disperse?" "I don't know," Samantha admitted, "but it's our only chance. We don't know how it controls them, but it's the key to ending this madness." A long silence fell between them as they watched the advancing zombies, now at the gates of the church. The survivors had fortified it as best they could, but the undead were pushing forward relentlessly, tearing through the wood and iron. It wouldn't hold much longer. "Then we move fast," Frank said, his voice steely. "We get to that thing before it gets away. If we don't, it'll be over for all of us." Samantha nodded. They were out of options. They had no choice but to go after the leader of the horde. The survivors mounted their trucks, ready to charge into the horde. Their modified vehicles, though battered and bruised from earlier, were their best shot at survival. With Alex in the lead, they surged forward, cutting through the zombies with the shrill screech of metal against bone. Samantha, Frank, and a handful of others followed closely behind, watching for the slightest movement of the glowing figure. The closer they got to the center of the horde, the more oppressive the air became. Samantha felt as though the very ground beneath her feet was alive, thrumming with the energy of the undead. It was as if the zombies were being drawn to the figure. Its power, its presence, was overwhelming. Suddenly, the figure emerged from the crowd, standing tall and imposing in the center of the horde. Its blue eyes glowed brighter now, and it raised its hand, signaling the zombies to pause. For a moment, everything went silent. "It's waiting for us," Frank muttered, his voice tense with anticipation. "It knows we're coming." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as the figure slowly turned its head, locking eyes with her once again. This time, the stare felt almost human. As if it recognized her, knew her. "We end this now," she whispered, her resolve hardening. They had to act quickly. Time was running out, and the fate of dead America was in their hands. End of Part 4. The tension in the air was palpable as the survivors drove their trucks closer to the heart of the undead horde. The glowing figure stood motionless, watching them approach with an unnerving calmness, its eyes locked on Samantha with a chilling intensity. It wasn't just a leader of the zombies, it was something far more sinister, something with purpose, something that had orchestrated every move since the outbreak began. The trucks tore through the zombie ranks, crushing bones and scattering undead bodies with every turn of the wheels. But despite their efforts, the horde was far from being stopped. It seemed endless, a dark sea of decaying flesh that surged forward relentlessly. The survivors, though determined, were being driven back by the overwhelming numbers. There was no clear path forward. "We need to stop the thing controlling them," Samantha shouted, her voice nearly drowned out by the roar of engines and gunfire. Frank, behind the wheel of the lead truck, nodded sharply. "I see it. We're getting closer." But as they pushed forward, the glow of the figure's eyes seemed to intensify, its presence becoming more powerful, more tangible. The air grew thick with a strange energy, a static charge that made the hairs on Samantha's neck stand on end. It was as though the very atmosphere had been warped by the creature's power. The undead didn't just stumble, they moved with purpose, driven by the will of their master. Suddenly, the figure raised both hands to the sky, and in that instant, the ground shook violently. The trucks faltered as the earth trembled beneath them, sending shockwaves through the streets. Zombies, instead of charging forward, now staggered back, retreating in an eerie, synchronized movement. Samantha's pulse quickened. What's it doing? It's controlling them. Frank's voice was tight with fear. It's trying to throw us off balance. The survivors barely managed to keep their trucks upright as the earth seemed to swallow everything in its path. The once pristine streets were now cracked, with deep fissures opening as though the very foundations of the town were being torn apart. Samantha could feel the ground beneath her tremble with each step of the horde, and the distant, glowing figure stood as though unaffected by the chaos it had just unleashed. "We need to hit it now," Samantha yelled. "While it's distracted." Frank slammed his foot on the accelerator, steering the truck toward the epicenter of the horde. The vehicles roared forward, their momentum carrying them through the chaos. As they neared the figure, it finally turned to face them. Its glowing blue eyes locked onto Samantha's, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world around her faded, leaving only the figure and its gaze. There was something in those eyes, something far older, far more dangerous, that made her blood run cold. But Samantha had no time for fear. She knew they couldn't stop now. With a swift motion, she loaded another bolt into her crossbow and aimed directly at the figure's chest. She fired, but the bolt seemed to dissolve into the air before it even reached its target. Her heart raced. "What the hell?" Samantha muttered, confusion and fear creeping into her mind. The figure raised one hand, and a wave of energy surged outward, knocking the trucks back. The shockwave sent debris flying, and several survivors were thrown from their vehicles. Samantha felt herself slammed against the truck's door as the world tilted violently. "Get up!" Frank shouted, struggling to regain control of the truck. He looked at Samantha, his expression hard. "We're not backing down. We'll push through, no matter what." She nodded, her mind racing. They had to stop the figure. But how? In the distance, Alex had managed to get the other trucks moving again, swerving between zombies as he tried to regroup. His voice crackled over the radio, distorted but clear. "Samantha. We're not going to last much longer if we don't take that thing down. I don't know what it is, but it's not just a zombie." Samantha's grip tightened on her crossbow. "I know, Alex. We're going to hit it head-on." Frank drove the truck directly toward the figure, swerving to avoid the rising tide of undead. As they approached, the figure raised both hands, and the ground beneath them erupted in a series of violent tremors. The trucks barely managed to stay upright as they plowed through the chaos. "We're too close," Frank shouted. "We need a better plan." Samantha scanned the area, her heart pounding. That's when she saw it, there, in the wreckage of an overturned truck, a set of old gas canisters, left behind by a previous group of survivors. They were piled up and abandoned, but it was a chance. "Frank! Stop the truck!" Samantha yelled. "We need those canisters." Frank, without hesitation, slammed the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt just feet from the gas canisters. The figure, still standing motionless at the center of the horde, didn't seem to notice them. It was too focused on its undead army, too consumed by its power to recognize the threat coming from behind. Samantha jumped from the truck, sprinting toward the canisters. The air seemed to buzz with electricity, and she could hear the low growl of the zombies growing louder as they closed in. But she had no choice. "Alex, get the other trucks ready," Samantha shouted over the radio. "We're about to give this thing a surprise." With shaky hands, she set up the canisters near the edge of the street, positioning them just right. She turned back to see Frank, his rifle raised, shooting off zombies as he protected their escape. Time was running out. As the figure continued to lead its army forward, Samantha took a deep breath and ran back toward the truck. "We're going to need a hell of a distraction," she muttered to herself, eyes flicking toward the glowing figure. And then, with a final, desperate plan, she knew what they had to do. End of Part 5. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm on the verge of breaking. Samantha, her hands still trembling from the urgency of the moment, glanced over at Frank, who was in the driver's seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They knew they were racing against time, with the horde closing in around them, and the leader still standing in the center of it all, radiating a deadly calm. Alex's voice crackled through the radio, his words sharp with determination. "Samantha, we're ready. Just say the word, and we'll hit it." "Hold tight," Samantha replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "We're going to make this one count." She cast one last glance at the glowing figure, the source of the horde's power, the one that controlled them. The undead had been relentless in their pursuit, their movements becoming more coordinated, almost strategic, as if they were part of a single mind. And that mind, Samantha realized, was the glowing figure that had been watching them from the very beginning. The survivors were counting on her. The people she had come to trust were now all gathered at the edge of the fight, their lives hanging in the balance. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. This gamble had to work. "Frank," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her, "when I give the signal, you floor it. We're going straight for the figure. Get as close as you can without getting caught in the blast." Frank nodded, determination burning in his eyes. "Understood. And if it doesn't work?" "We fight until we can't fight anymore," Samantha answered, her voice unwavering. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all they had. Samantha turned toward the canisters she had set up, the pieces of the puzzle coming together in her mind. The gas would create a massive explosion. But it wasn't just the explosion that would take down the figure, it was the shockwave, the destruction that would disorient the undead horde long enough to give them a fighting chance. With her hand still gripping the radio, Samantha issued the order. "Now, Alex. Hit it." Alex's response was immediate. The radio went silent for a moment, then erupted with the roar of engine power as the survivors' trucks surged forward, engines revving, the tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. Frank, following the plan, hit the accelerator. The truck jerked forward, kicking up dust and debris as they raced through the encroaching horde. The undead were still closing in, but Samantha felt her pulse quicken as she saw the gas canisters grow closer. With every passing second, it seemed like the figure was getting more and more aware of their movements, but Samantha didn't let herself hesitate. She had to trust that the plan would work. "We're almost there," she muttered, eyes locked on the canisters. Come on, come on." The trucks were nearly upon them when she gave the signal. "Now, Frank." In that instant, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Frank jerked the truck to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision with a group of zombies. The tires screamed as they skidded across the road, and then the impact came. Samantha threw herself to the ground as the trucks collided with the gas canisters, sending them tumbling into the center of the street. The figure, still standing motionless, finally seemed to notice the impending danger. Its blue eyes glowed even brighter as it raised its arms once more. Too late. The explosion that followed was deafening. The air was filled with an overwhelming rush of sound, heat, and destruction. The shockwave tore through the street, sending bodies flying and crushing everything in its path. Samantha felt the blast push her back, her body slamming into the ground with force. Her vision blurred for a split second, the air heavy with smoke and dust. For a moment, everything was still. Then the chaos erupted anew. Samantha struggled to her feet, her heart racing in her chest. The air smelled of smoke and burning debris, and the ground was littered with the remnants of the undead, their bodies scattered in every direction. The trucks, now a twisted wreck of metal and dust, had been pushed back by the explosion, but the survivors were still alive, barely. "Everyone all right?" Frank's voice came through the radio, strained but urgent. Samantha checked herself for injuries, nothing serious. Just bruises, dirt, and a few scrapes. She pushed herself up, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. "Still here," she responded, her voice tight. "But we need to move fast." "Is the leader still standing?" Frank's voice faltered for a second. "I don't see it." "Wait. There." The figure, though shaken by the blast, was still alive. Its glowing blue eyes flickered, but it was beginning to move. The explosion had weakened it, momentarily, but it was still a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't over. Samantha clenched her fists, adrenaline surging through her veins. "We need to finish this. Now." She grabbed her crossbow, preparing for another assault. But this time, she wasn't going to hesitate. This time, they would fight until the very end. The figure began to raise its arms again, its aura shimmering and pulsating. The ground trembled once more as the remaining zombies began to stir. It was trying to regain control, trying to regroup its forces. Samantha's voice was cold and determined as she turned toward Frank. "Get to the trucks. We're not letting it escape." Frank's nod was grim. "I'll follow your lead. Everyone else, stay sharp." "We're going after that thing," Samantha ordered. The final battle was about to begin. End of Part 6. The ground still smoldered from the explosion, the air thick with smoke and the remnants of the chaos that had unfolded. The horde had been momentarily scattered, but they were far from defeated. The figure, its glowing eyes still cutting through the smoke, was slowly regaining its composure, standing tall amid the wreckage of their last assault. Samantha's pulse raced as she surveyed the destruction. The undead, though disoriented by the blast, were beginning to regroup, their numbers swelling once again. But the figure, if they didn't take it down now, would reassert its control. And then there would be no stopping them. "We can't wait for another opening," Samantha said, her voice filled with steely determination as she looked at Frank and the survivors gathered around her. "It's now or never." Frank nodded sharply, gripping the steering wheel of his truck tightly. His jaw was clenched, eyes hard with resolve. "We'll finish it this time." Samantha checked her crossbow, the weight of the weapon familiar in her hands. The team had all managed to regroup, though they were battered and bruised. The earlier explosion had rattled them, but they were far from broken. The survivors were ready to fight, and they knew this was their last chance to take down the creature controlling the undead. "I'll take the lead," Samantha said, her voice cool but commanding. "Everyone else, stay in formation. We need to press the attack while we still can." Alex, ever the strategist, spoke up from the rear. "I've got the map. We'll head for the center of town. That's where we've seen the figure most often. If we can catch it in the open." "We will," Samantha cut in. "And we'll end this." With that, she signaled to Frank, and the trucks began moving again, slowly but steadily. The survivors maneuvered through the debris and wreckage, their path clear for the moment, but the undead were closing in again. Samantha could hear the relentless shuffle of feet and the groans of the horde, but she refused to let fear take hold. The figure's glowing eyes were now locked on them. It knew they were coming. But it seemed hesitant, as though waiting for them to make their move. "Get ready," Samantha murmured, her grip tightening on the crossbow. "This time, we're going to finish it." As they neared the center of town, the streets grew eerily quiet. The horde had formed a dense barricade between the survivors and their target. The figure stood at the far end of the street, an imposing silhouette against the smog-choked sky, its arms raised in a slow, deliberate gesture. It was readying itself to strike. Frank swerved the truck to the left, his tires skimming the edges of the sidewalk, narrowly avoiding a group of zombies. The survivors' trucks followed suit, staying in formation, ready for the assault. Samantha's eyes never left the figure as they closed the distance. The air felt electric with tension. She could see the blue glow of its eyes intensifying again, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble with a low, ominous hum. The figure was trying to call upon the last of its power. "We're not giving it the chance," Samantha shouted. "Go! Go! Go!" Frank roared, his foot slamming on the gas pedal. The truck surged forward, careening toward the figure. The zombies were closing in from all sides, but there was no hesitation in Samantha's movements. She steadied her crossbow and took aim at the figure. The moment they were close enough, she fired, her bolt shooting straight toward the creature's chest. But just as before, the bolt disintegrated into thin air, a protective barrier surrounding the figure, a shield of energy. Samantha cursed under her breath. Frank swerved to avoid an oncoming wave of zombies, his truck skidding dangerously on the pavement. The horde was closing in from all sides, but they were still focused on the glowing figure. It wasn't just commanding the undead, it was using them as a shield, as a distraction. "We need to hit it hard and fast," Samantha shouted. "Everyone, get out. Attack from all sides." Without waiting for a reply, Samantha flung herself out of the truck, landing hard on the cracked pavement. She immediately rolled to her feet and sprinted toward the figure, crossbow raised. The rest of the survivors followed suit, jumping from the trucks, their weapons at the ready. The figure's eyes locked on her as she approached, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. It raised its hands again, but this time, Samantha was ready. She ducked just in time as a wave of energy shot toward her, narrowly missing her. The shockwave sent a group of zombies flying into the air, but Samantha didn't stop. She continued her sprint toward the creature, zigzagging between the undead. Just as she reached the figure, she dove to the side, avoiding another blast of energy. The glowing creature faltered, momentarily distracted by the movement, and that was when Frank took his shot. He fired from the truck, his rifle aimed at the creature's chest. The shot hit the figure with a sickening thud. The protective shield flickered, and the glow in its eyes dimmed for a moment. Samantha, seeing her chance, lunged forward and fired her crossbow directly at the creature's heart. The bolt hit its mark, the impact stunning the figure for a split second. But it didn't fall. The glow in its eyes brightened again, and the energy it emitted flared with even more intensity. "We've got to keep hitting it," Alex shouted, pushing his way through the horde with his rifle raised. "We can't let it recover." But even as the survivors pressed forward, it became clear that the creature was more powerful than they had ever imagined. Its energy surged again, and the ground trembled as if the entire town was about to collapse beneath them. Samantha's mind raced. They couldn't keep this up forever. There had to be a way to break through. And then, in that moment, it hit her. The creature was relying on its energy, its shield, to protect itself. But it was also vulnerable to the very thing that powered it, the energy source. If they could disrupt it, they might stand a chance. Her voice rang out over the chaos. "We need to hit the energy source. Aim for the core." The survivors, understanding the plan, shifted their focus. Guns and crossbows fired at the creature's chest, trying to reach the heart of its power. The horde closed in around them, but the survivors were undeterred. They were out of time, but they weren't about to stop now. Samantha aimed one final shot, and hoped they were close enough to end it once and for all. End of Part 7. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, each beat an echo of the violence that surrounded her. The figure, the creature that had tormented them for days, stood before her, its body radiating a brilliant, almost blinding light. The air itself seemed to hum with its energy, vibrating the ground beneath her feet. It was no longer a mere monster, but a force of nature, seemingly unstoppable. But as the survivors regrouped, they knew that the only chance they had left was to reach the core, the source of its power. "Don't stop. Keep shooting," Samantha barked, her voice cutting through the roar of the horde. The survivors had circled around the creature, forming a makeshift barricade with their bodies and weapons. Frank fired relentlessly from the truck, while Alex, Julia, and the others spread out, their eyes locked on the target. Each shot they fired sent a ripple through the air, but the shield that protected the creature seemed impenetrable, absorbing everything that came its way. But Samantha's mind was clear, sharp with focus. She remembered the pulse of energy, the way it had surged from the figure, as though it were connected to something deeper, something inside. If they could disrupt the core of that power, if they could break the source that held it all together, they might have a chance to bring the creature down once and for all. Samantha's eyes narrowed as she scanned the creature's body, searching for anything that might be a weakness. The glowing blue light flickered faintly in the middle of its chest, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. There, right at its core. That was where the energy emanated from, where the very essence of its power was stored. It's there. Samantha shouted, pointing to the chest of the figure. Aim for the core. With newfound purpose, the survivors adjusted their aim. The creature, sensing their shift in strategy, let out a screech, its hands raised as it summoned a new wave of energy, this one more intense than any before. The ground cracked open, and the air became thick with the force of its power, sending tremors through the streets. But the survivors didn't falter. They had come too far to be intimidated now. Keep your focus. Samantha urged, her voice barely audible over the din of the energy-filled air. Frank slammed the truck into reverse, narrowly avoiding a group of zombies closing in on them. His eyes were locked on the figure as he lined up another shot. Samantha glanced over at him, her stomach knotting with tension. She knew the creature's power would reach its peak soon, and if they didn't act, the entire town would collapse under its grip. Julia, with her rifle raised, took the first shot. The bullet slammed into the figure's chest, causing the energy shield to flare with a blinding flash. The figure staggered, its glowing form flickering momentarily, but it quickly recovered. It's not enough. Julia shouted, frustration thick in her voice. Alex, seeing the same, nodded grimly. We need more firepower. The shields are too strong. Samantha's heart raced. There was no time left for hesitation. The core, the true source of the creature's power, had to be exposed. She couldn't wait any longer. Everyone, we hit it together. On my mark, Samantha commanded. She took a deep breath, focusing all her thoughts on the task ahead. She adjusted her grip on her crossbow, steadying her aim. In the background, the survivors prepared, each of them locking onto the glowing blue core. Now! Samantha shouted. In that instant, everything seemed to blur. The shots rang out in unison. Frank fired from the truck. Julia's rifle cracked. Alex's arrows flew, and the others unloaded every round they had. The concentrated fire hit the figure with an explosive force, but the shield still held. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature's body jerked violently, its energy flickering. The shield that had protected it began to waver. The blue light at its core, now exposed by the relentless barrage of attacks, shone even brighter for a moment, then began to sputter. Keep going. Don't stop. Samantha screamed, her voice raw. She took another shot, her crossbow bolt flying through the air. This time, it hit its mark. The bolt embedded itself directly into the glowing heart of the creature's chest, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, the creature's body erupted in a blinding flash of light, the shockwave sending everyone flying backward. The ground shook violently beneath their feet, the air crackling with the force of the release. The figure let out a deafening, bone-chilling scream as its form started to disintegrate, the energy that had fueled it unraveling. The survivors were knocked to the ground, dazed by the blast. Samantha's vision blurred as she struggled to stand. The pain from the explosion rang in her ears, but she ignored it, pushing herself upright. When she looked around, she saw the destruction in the wake of the explosion. The once towering figure was now nothing but a pile of ash and shattered energy. The horde, which had been so relentlessly controlled, fell silent, their movements slowing to a standstill. Without the figure to command them, the zombies began to lose their coordination, stumbling aimlessly, their hunger unsatisfied. The air grew quiet, save for the distant groans of the undead, now directionless and confused. Samantha took a staggering step forward, then another, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could hear the others starting to stir, but for a moment, she just stood there, watching the aftermath of the battle. They had done it. They had finally brought down the creature. We did it, Frank said, his voice hoarse but filled with disbelief. Samantha nodded, though she was too exhausted to speak. The weight of everything that had happened, of the sacrifices, the battles, the loss, hung heavily on her. But they had survived. They had won. For now. Samantha turned to the others. "It's over," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "We've won." But she knew, deep down, that the fight for survival wasn't over. This was only one battle in a war that would continue as long as the undead roamed the earth. The world had changed forever, and the survivors would need to adapt, rebuild, and fight once more. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. They had earned this moment. And they would fight for the next. End of Part 8. That concludes this 8-part outline of the zombie versus human fight story. If you'd like to refine anything or need another outline, feel free to ask. The dust settled, and the wreckage of the battle was laid out before them. The town was barely recognizable, half-destroyed buildings, cracked roads, and the faint scent of smoke still lingering in the air. The horde of zombies that had once been driven by a terrifying force had now become disorganized, aimlessly wandering through the ruins, their unity fractured. Samantha stood at the edge of the town square, her eyes scanning the horizon. The worst was over, but she could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her. It was a silence that had taken years to come, a silence born from the countless losses and sacrifices they had made along the way. "Is it really over?" Julia asked from behind her, her voice filled with uncertainty. Samantha turned to face her. Julia had been by her side from the beginning, and Samantha could see the same exhaustion in her eyes. It was the exhaustion of someone who had fought too many battles, lost too many people, and witnessed the destruction of everything they once knew. "It's over for now," Samantha replied softly. "But we've only just begun." Julia nodded, understanding what she meant. The world they once knew was gone. The cities, the governments, the systems they had relied on for stability, everything had crumbled under the weight of the undead plague. What remained were the survivors, the ordinary people who had fought against the odds, risen to the occasion, and become something greater than themselves in the process. "We need to start rebuilding," Julia said. "People will need to find a way to live again, even in a world like this." Samantha took a deep breath. "We'll figure it out. Together." The survivors were beginning to gather around them now, some helping each other up, others taking stock of their resources. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they had a future to look forward to. The world wasn't over, it was just different. Frank walked over, his face covered in grime, but there was a spark of hope in his eyes. He clapped Samantha on the back. "Hell of a fight," he said with a grin. "You know, I didn't think we'd make it, but damn, you pulled us through." Samantha returned his grin, though it was tired. "We pulled each other through." Frank looked around at the survivors, a small group of men and women who had once been strangers to each other. Now, they were a team, a family forged in the crucible of the apocalypse. They had come together to fight for their lives, and they had won. "We'll need to clear the area of any remaining zombies," Frank said, looking at the scattered undead still wandering through the streets. "But after that, we can start setting up a base. Maybe even begin reaching out to other survivors." Samantha's eyes wandered back to the ruins of the town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They could rebuild here. They could start something new. "We need to be careful," Samantha said, her tone serious. "We've won today, but this place, it's a reminder. We can't let our guard down." "I agree," Alex added as he approached, wiping sweat from his brow. "There are still pockets of the undead out there. And we don't know who, or what, else is left in this world." The others nodded in agreement. They all understood. The fight wasn't over. But they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had hope. Samantha took a long look at the horizon, her mind racing with possibilities. Rebuilding meant more than just clearing debris and finding shelter. It meant reclaiming the world they had lost, creating a new society, one built on survival, trust, and the lessons they had learned in the darkness. They had to find a way to live again. To grow again. But this time, they would be ready. "We'll need to establish communication with other survivor groups," Samantha said, breaking the silence. "Find out who's out there. We'll need to rebuild, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. There's strength in numbers." Julia nodded, and Frank took out a map, marking a few key locations where they could set up signals or find other survivors. "I've got some supplies in the truck," Frank said. "I'll start gathering what we need. We can fortify this place." "Good idea," Samantha said. "We'll need to secure the perimeter. Let's set up watch shifts, in case anything comes our way." As the survivors spread out to work, Samantha took one last look at the now dwindling horde of zombies. It was hard to believe that just days ago, they had been locked in a desperate battle for their lives. But now, standing in the ruins of the town, it was clear to her that this was just the beginning. The world was broken, but the survivors were still here. They had made it through the worst, and now, they had the opportunity to rebuild something stronger. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But they had one thing that the undead didn't: the will to fight, the strength to endure. And maybe, just maybe, the courage to rise above the ashes and build a new world. As the survivors worked together, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the destroyed town. It was a quiet moment, one that spoke of hope, of the promise of a new dawn. They had fought for their survival, and now, they would fight to create a future. A future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed possible. End of Part 9. Let me know if you'd like the final part or if you'd like any adjustments to the outline. The night had fallen, but the survivors didn't rest. Instead, they worked, rebuilding what had been lost, preparing for the uncertain road ahead. The makeshift camp was alive with activity. Flashlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows on the ruins. The sound of hammers and tools echoed through the streets, creating a steady rhythm in the silence of the world they now inhabited. The town that had been the site of their final, desperate battle was now becoming something more, a place of hope. Samantha walked through the camp, her gaze sweeping over the scene. People were setting up temporary shelters, organizing supplies, and securing the perimeter. It was a far cry from the chaos they had faced just days ago, but there was something different now. Something better. There was purpose in their actions. They weren't just surviving, they were rebuilding. They were creating something new. Samantha paused near a group of survivors working on fortifying one of the remaining buildings. She smiled faintly as she watched Frank directing a few of the younger men to work on reinforcing the doors and windows. They had become a team, more than a group of strangers. They had found a way to come together, to trust one another. "You think we can really do this?" Julia's voice broke through Samantha's thoughts. Samantha turned to see Julia standing beside her, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Her face was tired, but there was a determination in her eyes. Samantha didn't hesitate. "We can. We have to." Julia nodded, her eyes following the same scene as Samantha's: people working together, rebuilding, making a stand. The first steps toward a new world were being taken, even if they didn't fully understand what it would look like. "Do you think there are more of them out there?" Julia asked, her voice soft, but filled with an edge of concern. "The undead?" Samantha asked. Julia nodded. "We don't know," Samantha said, the uncertainty in her voice clear. "There could be pockets of them scattered across the country. And there could be other threats we haven't encountered yet. But the one thing we know for sure is that we're not alone anymore. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for the future. And that's something worth fighting for." Julia looked out at the camp, her gaze filled with a quiet resolve. "I think you're right. It's hard to see it sometimes, but this feels like the first real chance we've had to rebuild. It's not just about holding out any longer. We're starting something new." Samantha smiled and patted her on the shoulder. "Exactly. We'll make mistakes along the way, but we'll learn from them. And we'll keep going. We have each other." As they walked through the camp, their footsteps light on the ground, Samantha felt the weight of the future settle on her shoulders. It wasn't easy, but she knew it was possible. Together, they could face anything. They had already proven that. And now, they would build something new, something that wasn't defined by the past, something that was their own. The survivors continued to work throughout the night, their efforts relentless. They were building homes, repairing structures, and fortifying the town against whatever dangers might come. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, something that had been absent in the world before the outbreak. People who had once been strangers were now united, bound by the same goal, survival, and the chance to rebuild. Samantha found herself working alongside them, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, but her heart full of purpose. She could feel the shift inside her, a shift from fear and uncertainty to hope and determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks. They would face challenges, both from the world outside and the fractures within their own group. But they had something that the undead didn't. They had the will to move forward. To grow. To survive. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten, the first hints of a new day breaking through the dark horizon. The survivors paused for a moment, standing together, looking out at the town they were transforming into something that resembled home. It wasn't much yet, but it was theirs. They had taken back the world, piece by piece, and in that small victory, they had found something greater than survival. They had found purpose. They had found each other. Samantha stood at the center of the group, her eyes focused on the rising sun. The warmth of its light touched her face, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe in something greater than the nightmare that had come before. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice steady and filled with quiet strength. "But I do know this, we're not done yet. We will fight for this world. And together, we'll make it our own." The survivors gathered around her, their faces tired but resolute. In their eyes, she saw the same fire she felt burning inside her. They had survived the worst, and now they were going to rise above it. The undead might have taken everything, but they couldn't take away their will to live. To rebuild. The future was uncertain. The world was broken. But together, they would make it whole again. As the sun rose higher, casting its light over the town, the survivors stood strong, ready for whatever came next. The uprising was just beginning. End of Part 10. This concludes the 10-part story outline for The Uprising in Dead America. Ordinary people become heroes in the fight for survival. I hope it meets your expectations for suspense and engagement. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments or if you need another outline.